If you're looking to step away from the relentless, exhausting noise of the modern world, you are in exactly the right place. In this explainer, we're embarking on a pretty profound journey inward. We're going to explore the visual metaphors and the incredible philosophical depth of Ibn Arabi's framework for the 7 levels of the soul. Today, we're really zoning in on 4 core milestones of this inward ascent, tracing a path from the chaotic storms of our base ego all the way up to a state of absolute, tranquil surrender. It's a framework that completely challenges how we think about our minds, our morals, and honestly, the ultimate truth itself. So let's get right into it. There is a fundamental flaw in how we approach the mind today. The texts call it an empirical illusion. When we try to figure out who we are, what's our go-to? Modern psychology, right? But the inherent problem there is that we're trying to study the self from the position of the self. It's a closed loop. It keeps us entirely focused outward on the material world, just endlessly searching for answers in data and observation. To actually grasp human behavior and character according to this deeper philosophical framework, we need self-transcendence. We literally have to step outside that empirical illusion and journey inward to find the actual source of power. And that brings us to the core conflict underlying this entire journey. We're talking about the 21st century intellectual battle, which is a direct hangover from the Enlightenment era. Reason versus revelation. Think about it. During the Enlightenment, human reason effectively replaced divine revelation as the absolute criterion for truth in the West. That became the foundational premise of the secular societies most of us grew up in. But today, the sources argue, that very same question is bubbling right back to the surface. What is your ultimate standard for truth? Do you rely entirely on your own independent reasoning, or do you look to revelation? This is the central tension we have to navigate as we ascend through these spiritual degrees. Okay, let's dive into Section 1, Anatomy of the Soul, Mapping the Inward Journey. Because before we can climb through the degrees of the self, we actually need a metaphysical map to understand what makes this ascent possible in the first place.
This inward map isn't just your standard run-of-the-mill mind-body split. No, it is a dynamic, incredibly intricate ecosystem. First, you have the naps, your base ego, which is just constantly pulling you downward toward worldly distractions and desires. Fighting against that, you have your qalb, your spiritual heart, your aql, the intellect, and your ruh, the spirit. And all of those are yearning for higher divine alignment. This internal struggle, the jihad of nafs, is an ongoing purification process. Understanding this whole ecosystem is absolutely essential because it shows us that our intellect, the aql, is really just one single piece of a much larger spiritual puzzle.
So, how do we successfully navigate that map without just getting totally lost in skepticism? The sources emphasize a really critical practice, metacognition. This simply means thinking about thinking. It's about taking a step back and actually questioning the very premises we've been taught to accept blindly, like that Enlightenment idea that reason is the absolute one and only criterion for truth. The texts point out that when people are told to think for themselves, they usually fail to engage in this deeper metacognition. Sure, they use reason, but they never actually critique reason itself. To truly elevate the soul, we have to critically question those indoctrinated secular paradigms. Which brings us to Section 2, the first degree, the storm of the ego. And I have to warn you, this initial stage is anything but peaceful. It is harrowing, it's chaotic, and it's incredibly intense. Picture being trapped in the middle of a raging ocean, completely battered by intrusive thoughts and the destructive, egotistical waves of the lower self. This right here is the material self stuck in that empirical illusion we talked about earlier. It is a state of absolute turbulence. The soul just feels entirely overwhelmed by base desires, pride, and the relentless, exhausting demands of the ego. It's draining. To survive this storm, you've got to stop treading water and change your entire strategy. First up, you must absolutely reject the urge to look outward for validation or material solutions, and instead turn inward to the true source of power. Next, you have to actively engage in the internal spiritual struggle. It requires a conscious, daily fight to not just be swept away by your own base desires. You have to learn to actively oppose these waves if you want to even begin moving to the next level. Now, as the mind finally breaks the surface of those chaotic waters, the pacing of your inner life begins to shift. We reach Section 3, the second degree, moral awakening.
The violent waves recede, and they're replaced by a deep, contemplative gaze into the cosmos. In this second degree, the soul has a pretty profound realization. Actions have real consequences. It's no longer just about blindly reacting to the ego's demands. The intellect fully kicks in here, and the individual begins desperately seeking a moral compass. The mind tries to piece together universal truths, looking at symbols, patterns, and signs to make sense of the profound order of the universe. At this stage, the realization is incredibly stark. Actions have consequences. The soul demands a moral framework. Escaping the storm of the ego isn't just a one-time event, right? To stay out of the water permanently, you have to anchor yourself in a firm moral framework. Without it, your own questioning intellect will eventually just drag you right back into the chaos of the lower self. Let's see how this builds, because Section 4 takes us to the third degree ascension and peril. This is where things become highly illuminated, but also incredibly dangerous. The heavy influence of the lower self and those dark vices finally lifts, and the soul rises upward toward the brilliant light of the moral conscience. It feels like an absolute triumph. But the sources issue an urgent warning here. This state is highly perilous. This blinding light can actually lead you totally astray. It is exactly in this third degree that people fall into deviated rationalism or misguided spirituality. They feel enlightened, so they begin to rely solely on their own mind or their own emotional experiences, and they ultimately lose their grounding. So how do you survive this peril? It requires precise metacognitive steps. First, you have to intellectually deconstruct yourself into mind, matter, spirit, and free will to truly understand how you operate. Second, and this is massive, you must establish your hierarchy of truth. This is where you decide that divine revelation must supersede independent reasoning. And third, you must balance the strict law with the deeper spirit of the law. If you don't establish this hierarchy, your own reason will quietly just become your false god. To really hammer this point home, the texts bring in a fascinating reference from Western philosophy. Even Immanuel Kant, one of the ultimate intellectual giants of the Enlightenment, the guy who literally wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, realized the limits of the human mind. He concluded that reason cannot be used to prove or disprove the existence of God. Reason is strictly limited to the empirical world, to what you can measure and observe. It completely fails when it tries to grasp metaphysical truths. And this is exactly why the sources argue that independent reasoning can never, ever be the ultimate criterion. And when you deeply internalize those limits, you finally reach the spiritual climax of this ascent. Section 5, the fourth degree, serene surrender. This is the purified state. The chaotic waves of the first degree, entirely gone. They're replaced by tranquil waters and a beautiful, submissive humility under a serene sun. The dangerous, arrogant light of the third degree has been entirely tempered. The individual is veiled from the relentless noise of the world, having achieved true self-transcendence through a peaceful, quiet submission to divine geometry and order. It's just profoundly peaceful. The defining characteristic of this profound peace is that the ego's waves are totally subdued and the soul is completely cleansed of pride and intellectual arrogance. But the true anchor here is that final point, unconditional surrender to revelation as the absolute fracon, the ultimate criterion for truth. By accepting that our own reason is flawed and limited, we find absolute serenity in surrendering to a higher divine text. We finally, thankfully, stop fighting to be the center of the universe. Which leaves us with the ultimate question posed by this entire explainer. As you reflect on these milestones within Ibn Arabi's inward ascent, from the initial chaotic storm of the ego to the ultimate peace of serene surrender, ask yourself, what is your hierarchy of truth? When you strip away the modern empirical illusions, what is your absolute criterion? Is it the limited scope of human reason, or is it revelation? Thinking deeply about that question is the first true step on your own inward ascent. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today, and keep exploring.